Good afternoon. Welcome to Robots and Red Tape. I'm your host, Nick Shutt. Really appreciate everybody hopping on to listen to us today. Really happy and honored to have Mr. Dave Edgar here with us today. Dave, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well.
Awesome, man. Glad to hear it. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Would love it if you'd tell myself and the listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and kind of how you got here, man.
Well, I was one of the original email pioneers. I built the first gateways and bridges that linked the mini computers to the land based email systems. Now we're talking late 80s here,
Mm-hmm.
early 90s, but built the first gateways for CC Mail, Microsoft Mail, Lotus Notes, and a whole host of others. What I did is I came up with a process I called natural integration.
Mm-hmm.
It was a way to overlay computer systems together. Well, it caused quite a shock to the email community.
Mm-hmm.
They were all going on the standards based stuff, X400, X500 at the time. And general projects for large companies and organizations would take roughly about a year to 2 years to implement and
Mm-hmm.
cost millions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So all of a sudden, I walk in with this natural integration product and I integrate them in 15 minutes.
Wow.
And it was startling.
Mhm,
God, I remember I was actually in a meeting with one of my clients, RJ Reynolds.
mhm,
I fly in the morning, get the gateway installed. This is down in Winston-Salem.
mhm,
Uh, and then we have this meeting right after lunch.
mhm,
And so some of the participants, I of course say, we're ready to rock and roll. Gateway's
mhm,
running, man. You all are integrated. And several of the guys got upset and said, what are you talking about? We've been working on this project for a year and a half.
wow.
And you're telling me this thing is running right now?
Mhm, mhm,
It literally was a suspension of their belief structure.
right.
We had to sit there and literally convince them and show them it was actually running.
Mhm,
But, it's these types of revolutionary approaches, sometimes needed to, break the box, as we say, break out of the box you put yourself in. And our
mhm,
standards committees at the time kind of dropped us in one.
mhm,
Very difficult technology, very rigid in how it worked, very expensive. Well, I started selling gateways. My software ran in the White House for 8 years.
mhm,
Pentagon, Air Force, banks, World Bank, insurance companies, Fortune 500, you name it, from Associated Press to, FMC. Didn't
mhm.
matter what organization they were in, international government, did the Danish ministry and a bunch of other international agencies.
Amazing.
But people wanted email. Why? Because it was changing the world.
Yes.
And how it changed the world was all of a sudden, all that company memorandum
Mhm,
was electronic.
right.
All of a sudden, all those messages they were snail mailing everywhere, all of a
Mhm,
sudden were electronic and instant.
yep.
Because literally, we go from one system to the next in under 10 minutes.
It's
Now,
amazing.
at the time, 10 minutes, that sounds like a long time. This is in an industry where to go from one system to the other usually took 3 or 4 hours, and half the time didn't get there.
Wow. Mhm, absolutely.
So literally, we retransformed the landscape of email. Did the
Mhm,
first internet gateways,
mhm,
providing. I remember there was a big project at Associated Press where we integrated them worldwide.
mhm,
Now, this led me on to my next stage, which was something called the Data Distribution Service Standard. This
mhm,
was the optimal form of how do you do inter-process communication between computer programs.
mhm,
I built the first distribution system in 2001. In 2002, after 3.5 hours of debating the standards committee,
mhm,
I convinced them to make it a standard. And it's the standard today that many people use to link all their data together.
mhm,
So, a lot of history, a lot of sites,
mhm.
Oh, principal investigator with cooperative research agreements with a space warfare lab. I kind of been around the block a few thousand times.
Absolutely. Okay.
Always solving problems, solving problems. I'm a problem solver.
Absolutely, man. That's
Some
why.
used to call me the Lego maniac because I could figure out how to plug any two systems together.
It's awesome.
And
That's quite. That's a good nickname.
it was kind of crazy that way. People say, "Oh, you can't do that." Well, we just did.
Yeah. hmm Well, it's running. That's awesome, man. So how'd you go from, kind of emailing DDS to AI?
Well, I was working on a project, and this was about 10 years ago, and it had to do with radiation sensors.
hmm
And everything was going well. And, you know, the data was cool, and we were processing it in real time because I'm all about real time processing.
hmm
Put something across the network, I want it processed in real time. I don't want it going into our queue and processing later, because
hmm
whole different series of problems you can affect if you can go real time.
Absolutely.
But I ran into a problem. I ran into the volume problem. I was fine with 100 sensors, but all of a sudden you get up to 1,000 sensors, 10,000 sensors, and there just physically wasn't enough space in the network to do it. I mean, I literally hit the physical ceiling. I mean, I'm implementing at the most efficient level you could imagine. I count bytes, I count buffers, I count steps. I literally count all of these things. And no matter how fast I could make it, I couldn't get around the volume problem.
Right.
And it was this search for the volume problem that led me to AI, because I'm not an AI scientist.
hmm
My specialty is process and communications theory,
Right.
the farthest thing from AI.
hmm Absolutely.
So, but I was stuck with this volume problem. I knew there had to be an answer, but
hmm
where to find the answer? And if you got a physical limit of the universe, how do you get around it? Well, you go to quantum physics.
Right.
I got to have something that can break the rules of the universe here. I've got to get more data through the pipe so I can process it in real time, interpret it in real time.
hmm
And so what we did is we came up with a way to create an artificial quantum entanglement
Okay.
across the network. There's actually a method to do it. We could all sit around and wait for quantum computers to solve everything for us, but we'll be sitting here a while.
Yeah.
Much better way is to try to use quantum principles to use the equipment we have to solve our problems now.
Okay.
That was my general approach. But we found out by synchronizing the observation data and putting it into a separate, faster, synchronous pipe, it formed almost like a time tunnel,
hmm
where basically, if you didn't know anything about entanglement, it's basically 2 points in space that share the same state.
hmm
Well, that's pretty good for communication, because what's communication about? It's about sending things from A to B.
Right. Absolutely.
So if both my states are entangled, that allows me to do something else with the data.
hmm
Well, what else we did was, what you send through an entanglement is something known as entropy,
hmm
or commonly known as motion.
hmm
We transmit motion through the entanglement. We don't send data. We send its motion through the entanglement.
Okay.
Well, inside of an entanglement, there's motion has two classifications. It's either predictable or it's unpredictable.
hmm
Well, we found that we only had to ship the unpredictable data through. Why? Because the predictable data is shared in the state. So
hmm
A knows about the prediction just as well as B knows about the prediction.
hmm
So what it allowed us to do is literally get rid of all that data.
Right.
And the results were beyond outstanding.
hmm
I'm sitting here in a world that's lucky to get a 6 to 9 to 1 reduction. So for every 9 records, they only have to send one.
hmm
My initial prototype was doing 2,200 to 1.
Wow.
And I'm like, wow, that's pretty efficient.
Mhm. Absolutely.
I kind of
So
overshot where I was kind of aiming for. I was thinking maybe I could get like a 50 to 1 reduction. And here I'm sitting at 2,200 to 1. And here was the crazy thing, it had no intelligence. That was just the basic system. But it
mhm,
was the system that if it got more intelligent, it would get more efficient.
right.
So
Mhm,
as you dump more data in it, it had more experience. It would get more and more and more efficient. We're still not even sure where the outer bounds of this thing are.
mhm.
I've got a current model, it's running at about 3,200 to 1.
Wow. Mhm. Is
We
the
put,
standard still 6 or 9 to 1 in a lot of
yeah,
places across the
yeah, oh,
industry?
yeah.
Mhm.
If they're lucky.
Okay.
And
That's if they're
halftime,
really good.
yeah, and halftime they're throwing a lot of data away. You're losing a lot of information.
Mhm, mhm,
So all of a sudden, we have solved the volume problem. And it's like,
mhm,
oh my gosh, what does this mean?
mhm.
It's one thing to solve a problem, it's another thing to just blow the problem completely out of the water.
Absolutely.
So I'm sitting there and saying, oh, this is too efficient to not exist in nature.
Mhm,
See, because remember, I told you I'm not an AI guy. I'm not even looking to do AI,
mhm. Yeah.
but I am looking to find out where this algorithm may be present.
Mhm.
And since it has to do with intelligence, where do you look? Well, you look in the brain.
Right.
There it is.
Mhm.
A perfect
Absolutely.
example for everything, right?
Mhm,
And damn if I didn't find it. Sitting smack in the middle of each lobe of our brain. There's a component called the thalamus,
mhm,
and one exists in each lobe. The
mhm.
thalamus is running this algorithm.
Really.
It's incredible.
Mhm,
Not only have we this algorithm have we figured out how to, the brain was processing information, but we had also solved one of the bigger questions, which is known as the unity. This is a subject of the theory of everything,
mhm,
where they're trying to figure out how 2 points in space can share the same state.
mhm.
And it had actually given the answer to that.
Okay.
What happens is, while it's in this entanglement, the brain links all the other components of the brain together into a single state because it needs to be in a single state to do measurement because it's measuring existence. It's measuring whatever, right? It's sensory data measuring itself. That's why you can sit here and look at me
Right.
on this podcast. Your
Mhm,
sensor data is cranking away.
mhm. Absolutely.
And we had actually tapped into that process. And this gave us the why everybody had been looking for. Why
Mhm,
does the brain do what it does?
mhm.
And that put me on the path.
Okay. And
Uh,
so go ahead.
it's the AI path,
Mhm.
you know,
Absolutely.
because knowing this algorithm, what else could we surmise and figure out on the brain?
Mhm.
So, not like I didn't have enough garbage shoved in my head.
Yeah.
I said, okay, all right, let's go from quantum physics and we'll go to neurology.
Mhm. Right.
Time for a good dose of neuroscience.
Mhm.
And we started following the path, and the path was unusually straight. Usually you have paths through figuring things out and they go left, right. This path was like a straight path through.
Okay.
And we figured out that how the occipital lobe actually functions and what it's doing. And it was a lot of work looking through a lot of studies, study after study after study. What I found most distressing, these were not nice studies, a lot of animal experiments.
Mhm.
And what was interesting is most of the people that were doing the studies, they were just looking for random correlation.
Right.
We could actually look at the studies and pull the information out of what was actually meaningful, why a particular thing was doing something. See, right now, most of science, especially when it concerns the brain, they know what.
Mhm.
They do not know why.
Will you elaborate on what you mean by that a little bit for the audience?
Well, in science, and you see this in neuroscience, you see it in AI, you see it in the medical community all over the place.
Mhm.
They don't know the cause of something.
Right.
Something's happening, in your brain. So, you're having a epileptic fit. You're having something going on. Parkinson's, good example.
Mm-hmm.
Parkinson's is actually a malfunction in a modulator in your parietal lobe.
Mm-hmm.
Now they can tell you what's happened, the effect of it.
Right.
This has messed up his ability to keep his hands still, all these things, but they cannot tell you the cause of it, the
Mm-hmm.
actual causal root of why did you get Parkinson's.
Right.
Now, when you have the why, you'll know where to go. You can create a solution that's 100% every time. But if you do not have the why, what do? You take the effects and you measure them mathematically,
Mm-hmm.
basically trying to do a statistical regression to try to approximate a cause.
Okay.
So you do all this calculation and calculation, say most likely it's this.
Mm-hmm.
We
Right.
think this is what's happening with it. And they'll give you a med. And if it's 70% effective, they'll celebrate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In my world, 70% sucks.
Right. Absolutely. You can't 70% send an email.
Yeah. Hey,
Right.
don't worry. I got rid of 70% of all the terrorists in the building.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I
That's not
mean,
okay.
70% is not good.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that is they're approximating intelligence. They're not actually producing intelligence. It's a
Mm-hmm.
mimicry. They're mimicking what intelligence should look like based upon a mathematical calculation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not what it is at all.
Mm-hmm.
Intelligence actually has a purpose in the universe. And this is, of course, what led me to AI,
Okay.
finding that purpose and seeing how the brain's process, the physical process,
Mm-hmm.
satisfies that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing we learned is that intelligence is the other side of the coin of life. They go together. Life and intelligence are literally one system. The purpose of intelligence is to preserve life.
Yes.
That is what it does. That is
Mm-hmm.
why it's there. It exists in every cell,
Mm-hmm.
cellular creature, from amoeba to a plant.
Mm-hmm.
You don't necessarily have to have a brain to run this algorithm.
Right.
Brain's not a lot better because it's cooler and much faster,
Right.
but you don't have to have it.
Mm-hmm.
But intelligence allows any living creature to adapt.
Mm-hmm.
It, you adapt to your environment. And that process is defined. And what the brain does more better than any other system is it allows that adaptation to be very, very precise.
Mm-hmm.
So all of a sudden, something you're eating is not working for you. You eat something else.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the interesting part about it is the brain is just executing a process. It doesn't know the difference if you're a monkey gathering a banana or
Mm-hmm.
a rocket scientist looking for the candy machine.
Right.
To the
Mm-hmm.
brain, it's all the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
You're surviving
Right. Absolutely.
and you're using your intelligence to survive
Right.
and adapt and literally perpetuate life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So again, this of course led us down the path of AI. How our decisions, how we didn't realize it at the time, but we had actually stumbled into the thought production process.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the reasons it's so efficient.
Right.
The quantum entanglement allows knowledge to pass without data, without words.
Mm-hmm.
See, our current models, like language models, this is all about words.
Mm-hmm.
How many words are going to predict the next token?
Right.
you
Mm-hmm.
know, if you look at any of our communication algorithms, they're all based on talking.
Mm-hmm.
Every
Yeah.
one of them is based on talking.
Which
The
is not the
problem,
most efficient way to communicate by any stretch of the imagination.
no. If the brain had to talk, it would die in about 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
It would not be able to process the data quick enough and interpret it
Right.
because it's
Mm-hmm.
not just sending the data through a pipe.
No.
It has to
Right.
be able to process the data when it comes out of the pipe.
Mm-hmm.
And this
Okay.
just wasn't possible. It's not possible with the current algorithms.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Right.
stuck on language models, which need, as they like to say, if you have to talk or use language, you have to send every word.
Mm-hmm.
And here we're sending knowledge without words. In one case, it's called, predictable motion,
Mhm.
right? But in the other case, it's knowledge transferring about your state.
Mhm. Absolutely. Sure.
And interesting enough, it's transferring through your brain with no data requirement.
Mm.
So this kind of led us to neuro-symbolic AI.
Okay. Mhm. And so this is a principle that you and your team has developed. And it's and what do you so when you think about how it operates, how does it differ from like a more traditional AI system? And how are you able to apply many of the principles that you just spoke about in a way that others can't?
Well, it's quite different because it's actually two forms of intelligence.
Okay.
Neuro-symbolic AI embraces two different types of intelligence merged together into a single hybrid system, just like your brain does. There's a level that is the general intelligence. This is the level of the physical system where the quantum entanglement is worried about moving unpredictable motion
Mm-hmm.
through the system. It's
Mm-hmm.
very regimented, it's very high speed, as we like to say, it's bottom up.
Right.
Symbolic intelligence is how we actually interpret that data.
Mm-hmm.
The brain doesn't interpret data, it just moves it about,
Mm-hmm.
use it where it needs to go and what it can be used for. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't understand, like I say, it doesn't understand if you're gathering a banana or looking for a candy bar.
It just knows
Doesn't
you're hungry.
matter. It knows there's a hunger thing and it's processing the data to satisfy that hunger. Whatever that activity or experience that you put in your brain
Mm-hmm.
has recorded to satisfy that experience. That's
Mm-hmm.
all it cares about.
Right.
Now, symbolic intelligence is how we figure out the content of data. Who knew the Egyptians were actually onto something there? You know,
Mhm. Absolutely.
everything we do is a symbol. Everything,
Mm-hmm.
even what we hear, see, smell, touch, all are converted to symbols in the inside of the brain. And that was when we discovered one of the big secrets of the brain. The visual cortex is anything but. The brain is dumping all its sensory data, minus smell, into
Mm-hmm.
the occipital lobe. And it's doing this because it wants it all symbolized, because it's a visual cortex.
Right.
If you want to make symbols, where do you go? You go to the visual cortex,
Correct.
because that's what it does.
Mm-hmm.
So this showed us the actual execution path of the brain itself and how the thoughts were actually composed of and translated. So basically, your occipital lobe is a giant translator.
Mm-hmm.
It's translating general intelligence to symbolic intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Allows you to interpret, make decisions, and then it converts it back
Right.
because it runs on general intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting in that if you may recognize this if you've ever studied consciousness studies, some of the philosophies of the mind. This is duality theory.
Mm-hmm.
One system that processes bottom up and the other system that processes top down.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. Aristotle, he of course argued top down.
Mm-hmm.
David Hume, of course, argued it's bottom up. And they actually go together into one system. And this is what allows the brain to be so efficient, but also be so intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
It allows these characteristics to go together, which they usually don't. If you look at current AI, a large language model has no concept of what the data means.
Right.
It's trying to do things very fast. It's trying to predict the next token
Right.
without understanding the content.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be married to a more symbolic approach that can actually do the analysis
Mm-hmm.
of that.
Right.
But again, where does it all start? It started with solving the volume problem
Mhm.
because this is sorting out all the motion. And that turns out to be the key to unraveling the rest of the steps.
Mhm.
Because what the occipital lobe is doing is processing anything that's unpredictable. Your thought structure is only interested in what's unpredictable.
Right.
Something that's predictable, I mean, just sitting here talking, it's predictable.
Mhm.
You don't care. You're not processing. It's not entering into your thought because you don't need a thought about it.
Right. That's why I don't pay it. I'm not gonna say don't pay attention. Like when after you master something, like I've driven for so many hours that I don't have to pay attention to every single thing all the time, constantly, in a way. And that's also, I would assume, why when you're learning a new skill up front, it is so much more taxing and mentally demanding than when you've
Yes.
been with the system for a while or been working on something for a while and you can do it while doing other things then, right?
Yeah. Well, it turns out that this front end system isn't about just creating thoughts.
Hmm.
It's about automation. Because
Yeah.
what does it do with all the predictable motion?
It
Well,
just
it just automates.
right.
It doesn't
Mhm,
need to think about it. It doesn't need to interpret it. It doesn't
mhm,
need to do anything with it. It knows it's there, so it can automate. So when you learn to ride a bike as a child, you
mhm,
actually program the intelligence to ride that bike into your system.
mhm,
Now your system can automate the entire sensory experience, the entire activity without you thinking about it.
right.
That's why you can sit on a bike, ride along, and think about whatever you really want to.
Mhm,
Your brain is going to sit there and execute all the things from your experience to make it go along.
mhm,
That's why it's interesting to watch baseball players. They go into slumps and everything else, and you often heard, well, they're overthinking the ball.
mhm,
But you know what? They're exactly correct.
mhm,
If they just let their bodies deal with it without overthinking it, they would
mhm,
do better
right.
because they've trained themselves to hit this ball a certain way or look for this, or your body's going to do that automatically.
Mhm,
And it's doing it very, very fast, much faster than you can think.
right.
Cognitive thought, where we do symbolic intelligence, that requires translation,
Mhm,
requires that you interpret it and make some decision.
mhm,
That's a lot of time in the world of real time.
right. Absolutely.
How else could you hit a baseball traveling 95 miles an hour at you?
Well, I can, but let's not,
Well,
I didn't train to, right?
yeah, if
Uh,
you trained your body to, you would be able to.
correct. Absolutely.
If they're like my hands, though, it'd still hurt like hell.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely. But yeah, no, it's fascinating because, it's the same thing. Any skill cap, anything you do, you just, I mean, similarly, like with basketball players, when they're in a
Yes.
slump, you just got to shoot their way out of the slump because they're just they overthink everything, and when you're overthinking it, and it's the same thing that when you say a word, and I don't know if you've ever done this, like say a word over and over and over and over and over again. After a while, you just can't it doesn't come out right a lot of the time, or it just starts sounding weird, and it's because you're probably not thinking about it when you're doing it because it's just automatic
It just
motion.
comes out.
Mhm,
This is this is actually your subconscious system.
mhm,
It occupies 99% of your brain's function. It is automating everything from your breathing to your standing to you shaking your head at me right
mhm. Yeah,
now.
I didn't know I was doing that.
No, but these are the cues. It all happens. It's going without you having to think.
Right.
That's why it is subconscious, no conscious thought required.
Mhm.
And that becomes the key to some of the next level. Why is the brain trying to automate everything?
I would assume efficiency.
Well, and what does efficiency give you?
You
The greatest chance to survive.
mhm, right.
You live on
Mhm,
because everything's predictable. The brain wants everything predictable. It actually monitors it.
mhm. Is that also I would assume that that also dovetails into why it's so hard to break habits and things like that, right?
Yes, because you've literally programmed your body to do a certain thing.
Mhm,
You've programmed yourself to be right-handed,
mm,
left-handed. All these things are very difficult to break because they go without thinking. So to break them, you almost have to become a child again
mhm,
and relearn it.
mhm.
You know,
Absolutely. 100%.
and it's interesting that the body just patterns what you do. It
Mhm,
doesn't limit what you do. It doesn't care what decisions you make. But what it wants to know is everything okay?
mhm,
It actually monitors your prediction level. There's actually an amygdala in each side of your hippocampus that measures how much prediction has been met.
mhm,
If you meet prediction, brain's happy. You can release dopamine and all kinds of other cool chemicals for you, and you're a happy guy.
Mhm.
If things aren't being predictable, it will generate fear.
Mhm.
It's trying to tell the brain, I need to survive, help me.
Mhm.
It's
Right.
actually communicating. And this became the understanding this became the key. Because
Mhm.
one of the things in duality theory is something called the explanation gap.
Right.
How do the two systems work together? Since they're totally different, how do they work together? Well, emotions were the way they work together.
Mm. Okay.
And that's why anything in your memory is actually cross listed with an emotion. If you want to remember anything, get emotional about it. You'll never forget it.
Mhm.
It will stay in your memory forever because it actually becomes cross listed in your neural net with everything else.
Mhm.
So these emotions allow the body to communicate as well as match memory, whether you're conscious or not conscious. Why? Because the brain, the body wants to survive, it wants to live. And
Mhm.
it's basically tapping off of your consciousness to figure out how to do that.
Okay. That's really cool. Really
It's kind of freaky that the answer was sitting right in front of us. I know
abstract.
I know they've been talking about explanation gap for probably 10 or 15, 20 years at least. Who knows?
Mhm. Uh-huh.
But there are ways things tie together because it is true, two different forms of intelligence, they can't talk. They don't
Mhm.
have to talk together. The
Right.
brain doesn't understand a damn thing about symbols.
Mhm.
And your symbolic approach, what do you know about the structure of a neuron?
Mhm.
You know?
No,
Why do
nothing.
you care?
Mhm.
You don't.
Right. Absolutely. Most of the time, I would assume. Yeah. And so I know, we're talking a lot about your, neurosymbolic AI system and algorithms and how much more efficient they are. And now, and a lot of the reasons why, and I appreciate that when you start thinking about, some like practical applications for a system that's this much more efficient, kind of what are some of the key benefits of this increased efficiency? And how does that translate into a practical application?
Well, the key benefits first are energy savings. It is an algorithm based on energy conservation.
Mhm.
It will use the least amount of energy to produce intelligence, and it will use that intelligence to and continue to improve its energy efficiency.
Mhm.
This is quite different than our current AIs.
Mhm.
A lot of people don't realize the brain runs on 20 watts. A single NVIDIA 4090 card needs 450 watts.
Mhm.
You multiply that out, well, that's 22 brains.
Right.
Is that
Absolutely.
one video card better than 22 brains?
Not even close.
Not even close.
Mhm.
And they're not just using one video card. They got 256, 512 of these things
Mhm.
arrayed together, more, thousands in some arrays.
Mhm.
So here they're using, oh my gosh, if it's 256, they're using 112,000 watts.
Mhm.
Multiply your brains into that.
Right.
That's a lot of people to do very little.
Mhm.
It always frightens me in a way. I see this entire data center running AI. It's got the energy and water signature of a small town, and it's
Mhm.
less intelligent than the fruit fly hovering around my room in the kitchen. You know,
Yeah. Mhm.
it's like, are you kidding me? There are different ways. So, one of the key benefits is energy savings.
Mhm.
Also, size. Intelligence runs on the birds and the bees.
Right.
We can create intelligence of any order that literally can function at any level. It could be
Mhm.
running in your smartwatch. It could be running on your handheld or,
Mhm.
or in a sensor itself.
Yeah.
Because one, it doesn't use the energy and it doesn't need a lot of horsepower.
Right.
We figure these things are going to be running on 20 watts or less on a little mini computer,
Mhm.
not some giant cloud array,
Right.
you
Mhm.
know.
Yeah. So
If
what are
you
some
look
of
at
the
it,
use cases you guys have now? Sorry for cutting you up.
what was that?
What are some of the use cases you guys have at this time?
Well, we've seen a lot of different interest, obviously, from the military.
Mhm.
medical, because what it does, and I haven't got to how we use it yet.
I'm sorry for jumping ahead. My
You're kind of
apologies.
skipping ahead on me, which
I'm
is okay.
sorry, man. You want yeah, you can yeah,
Yeah,
we
I take it any way you give it to me, man. But some of the use, it basically turns a user into a super user.
Mhm.
It basically allows a person to see and use the computer's information just like they use their bodies.
Okay.
So if you have a nurse, you have a super nurse. They can not just see one patient, they can see hundreds of patients and understand their conditions in real time,
Mhm.
not through some clunky ass dashboard. If you ever been in an emergency room in a big hospital on a Saturday night, you see that the disaster of that mess.
Mhm.
All these poor doctors and nurses spending half their time trying to massage a dashboard.
Mhm.
Dashboards are kind of cool, but once you get a beyond 25 entries, they're pretty useless
Mhm.
because you have to scroll the screen and everything else.
Mhm.
And they're presenting data rather opaquely.
Mhm.
If you've actually turned the data into symbolic language that you can understand, now all of a sudden that nurse or that military or some other person in a corporation or industry or anything else can now see that data in real time,
Mhm.
which leads to another one of the key benefits: real time.
Mhm.
If you look at most of these AI systems, they're kind of like post-mortem,
Mhm.
after the fact. We got to clean up. As they say, you can fix a problem with a mop or a stick.
Mhm. Right.
Are you mopping up the mess, or are you using a stick on the front end of it to make sure it doesn't happen?
Mhm.
So this moves all of that to the front. I was talking to a guy who works in insurance claims the other day
Mhm.
about using this type of AI to help them monitor claim adjustments.
Mhm.
So as they're filling out the claims, all this information that is necessary to determine is being presented to them at the very time,
Mhm.
as opposed to an AI system that has to go along 5 months later and try to figure out where the screw ups were.
Mhm.
Again, proactive about decision making as opposed to reactive about
Mhm.
decision making. Big difference when you're making decisions in real time as opposed to, making decisions in some time.
Mhm. Mhm.
One of the reasons they have so many problems with the self-driving car.
Right.
You know, what did Elon say? You'd have it in 2016.
Mhm.
Well, we're 8 years later.
Right.
We're
Still don't have it.
still don't have it.
Mhm.
Uh, and that's why when you look at a lot of these companies, especially in hard business and where money, time, and everything, you know, is all money. It's
Mhm.
money, money, money.
Yep.
Hallucinations, things like that. It's funny. I love hallucinations when I hear the word.
Mhm.
Oh, say I had a problem and it hallucinated. In my day, we call that a system failure, an
Right.
error. It didn't work.
Mhm.
It.
Mhm.
And you ask them, fix it. They don't even know why it malfunctioned.
Yeah. Half the time, at least.
No, I mean, they'll go in there and have to retrain that thing for 6 months on a
Mhm.
new set of data because
Right.
it's going to be profoundly reactive to the data. It can't interpret it after the fact. It's just patterns.
Right. Mhm.
What do the patterns mean? Well, a lot of that stuff also proceeds on a false premise. That false premise being that everything can be known.
Mhm.
I don't know what world they live in.
Right.
Everything cannot be known. There's
Mhm.
always new experiences, new variations, new everything.
Mhm.
To think that you can figure out that every possible condition that could ever possibly exist and then somehow put its pattern matching in.
Mhm.
Well, that's why a self-driving car has problems driving, even though it's had 1,000,000 hours of driving experience. 1,000,000.
Right.
And I guarantee you, Tesla's got a lot more than 1,000,000.
Right. Mhm.
And standard human, 20 hours.
Mhm.
Why? Because they generalize the knowledge. They know the context of the knowledge and the patterns they see, not just the patterns themselves.
Right.
Again, the difference between knowledge and intelligence. Knowledge provides you information.
Mhm.
But intelligence tells you how to use the information, how to
Abs
interpret that information.
Mhm. Abs
So when they say AI, it's really a misnomer.
Mhm.
It's
Right.
artificial knowledge. It's really not artificial intelligence.
Okay. And your system is intelligent.
Yes.
Mhm.
Well, we based it on how the brain learns.
Mhm.
We've converted the symbols, and we use a device we call the cognitive object interface. We call it the COI.
Mhm.
A lot easier than saying that other stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, the COI is designed to do one thing: produce symbolic awareness to a user.
Mhm.
So we've taken all the computer data, organized it, converted it to symbols, and we put it out on a display.
Mhm.
Now the user literally sees the awareness of the system and plays a game, the game of survival.
Mhm.
So what this allows the user to do is tell us what to do with this data when we see these patterns.
Mhm.
So it literally, the computer subconscious learns and automates from a human user. We deferred building artificial consciousness at this time because we don't know enough about it yet.
Right.
We've got a lot of safety. This is, you're dealing with two forms of intelligence that communicate using emotions.
Mhm.
Use your imagination. That kind of a formula can kind of screw up pretty badly.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
You talk about your Terminator future. That's
Mhm.
worse.
Right. Yeah, that's the last thing we need.
Yeah, you
One
don't
of
need that kind of stuff. But
them.
so we decided to defer artificial consciousness and use our COI to interface with a human and allow them to be the consciousness for the computer.
Okay.
So in that, we give them the power of the computer, make them the super user.
Mhm.
They can see more, do more, understand more.
Mhm.
They can see thousands, tens of thousands of different sensory data, computer data, patterns, and it organizes it for their understanding. What they give us is reactions.
Mhm.
And the reactions then form the intelligence that feed back down into the quantum entanglement, the
Mhm.
predictions as it's looking for, and
Mhm.
makes that more efficient.
Mhm.
Again, it's self-perpetuating.
Mhm.
So each time it cycles, it gets smarter, 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 uses less energy, less energy, less energy.
Mhm.
So now we've got an intelligence that can be in any size, use the least amount of electricity, and operates in real time.
Mhm.
These are the characteristics of human thinking.
Mhm.
Now, where can we apply these types of things? Well, it can revolutionize almost anything you want to do.
Right.
You could build any number of killer apps, as
Mhm.
they love to call them. They certainly don't have any in current AI.
Right.
And we say that they don't have they don't. It's not that they don't have cool apps. They do. Something I'll crank out a bunch of content and video for you or do some programming. I love code generators.
Mhm.
I worked on
Mhm.
those things back in the 90s.
Right.
anything I can duplicate all that repetitive code, I'm all for.
Right.
But it's really replacing what we already know how to do.
Mhm.
It's not improving on anything.
Mhm.
Not making our understanding, our ability to execute a job faster.
Mhm.
You know, it's basically helping us generate content without a lot of training.
Right. And to
Content we can generate ourselves.
Right, and to the point that you just made, and from the folks I've spoken to about specifically about code generators, is they're actually pretty good when it comes to commonly solved problems. But when you try to apply the code to something that it hasn't seen enough times, it'll get there eventually, but it'll do it in an incredibly inefficient ways.
Yeah. Well, if it gets there at all.
Yes.
You remember from my discussion of my background, there
Hmm.
are times you have to leap out of the box.
Yeah, absolutely.
Current AI cannot leap out of it. It is bound by the box.
Hmm. Right, and
Uh,
that's I think that from our previous discussion that touches on transitive inference, correct?
That's correct.
Mhm.
And transitive inference is a skill that the language model can't do.
Right.
Well, what is transitive inference? It's the ability to rationalize where no previous observation or experience exists.
Mhm.
The best way to understand it is A is greater than B and B is greater than C. So transitive inference then tells us that A is greater than C.
Mhm.
Sounds like a simple formula, but it's a
Yep.
formula they cannot do. Why? Because the language model, to know that information, would have to have experience with A and C,
Mhm.
which it doesn't have. It's the
Mhm.
ability to link objects together, even though there's no previous experience with those objects.
Mhm.
And this is what our koi was meant to actually do. We actually arranged the symbols and we put them on tiles and arranged them in such a way
Mhm.
that we're using visual symmetry to generate the inference. So, in
Mhm.
other words, a user matches symbols in certain boxes with symbols in other boxes. Why? Because their eyesight naturally does that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
when you do that, it actually generates the inference you need to understand something.
Mhm.
That's why when we say you can actually get not just awareness, but you can actually get comprehension,
Mhm.
comprehending what is actually on the display.
Right.
Now, what's cool is since we know how the brain operates and how to duplicate it, that allows us to know how to interface it as well.
Mhm.
So the koi is designed to align with your occipital lobe.
Okay.
So as you know, learn these symbols, your occipital lobe actually becomes trained in those symbols because it's a symbol converter.
Right. Mhm.
So once it's with that alignment, as you make decisions, then the automatic subconscious, the computer subconscious, can then harvest your intelligence
Mhm.
and learn how to do things, whether that's operating a machine,
Mhm.
flying a helicopter, it doesn't matter.
Right.
It's just an activity at the end of the day that you've learned how to do. And what it did is it translated what that was down into general intelligence.
Mhm.
And it can automate it all, whether you want me to or not. I'm going to automate it.
Right. Absolutely. For efficiency and survival.
Yeah,
Mhm.
everything is survival.
Yep. Absolutely.
Face it, life has kind of really two primary functions. One, to measure itself,
Mhm.
measure its existence.
Mhm.
Two, to preserve that existence. That's
Yeah.
it.
Mhm.
Everything past that is a plus.
Right.
As
Absolutely.
long as you satisfy those two things, the ability to measure
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
the
man.
ability to preserve.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
it's interesting how all the algorithms tie into that
Mhm.
question.
I was gonna say earlier, you'd mentioned that all senses get processed through the occipital lobe except for smell.
Smell
Uh,
seems there are certain things that are weird. I haven't tracked them down yet
mhm.
to figure out exactly how they get tied in. Smell seems to be one of those.
Okay.
Most of everything gets merged in at the geniculate layer because there's a geniculate layer that sits underneath the thalamus.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
all your audio visual senses all go into this layer. The only
Mhm.
one that seems to bypass it is smell. It goes into a bulb, but I think it gets merged in later on in the process. I really still need to track it down. It's interesting too, like color does not survive the primary visual cortex in the symbol translation
Interesting.
because color, I guess, has no natural definition, has no symbolic thing we can convert it to.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean we can't perceive color. What's interesting is color is actually merged back into the occipital lobe above the symbol converter.
Mm. Okay.
So symbol conversion, everything goes into V1, primary
Mhm.
visual cortex. Symbols go up to V2 and V3, and then everything is produced in memory in V4. So color comes back into the
Mhm.
system on V4. It's
Mhm.
actually bypassed the process. So
Interesting.
it's kind of interesting stuff on why I guess color just doesn't have a translation.
Hmm.
Just like emotions to you consciously, emotions have no translation.
Yeah.
The body can't say you're afraid. The body
Mhm.
can't say you're happy, or it can release chemicals
Mhm.
that basically change your physical condition.
Mhm.
Try to get noticed. So
Right.
if you begin to fear something, you may begin to sweat. You may
Mhm.
begin to have cold chills. The body is using emotions to alter the physical state to get your attention
Mhm.
because there
Absolutely.
is no translation for emotions.
Mhm.
What's the symbol for this? What's the symbol for hate or love? We can come up with all kinds of. What does the body know about? The brain doesn't know anything about symbols.
Mhm.
It knows about chemical release.
Yes. Mhm.
So
Absolutely.
interesting way. And I often say to people, we are the pets of our brains.
Mhm.
They treat
Mhm.
us like pets. If
Yeah.
we do things right, they make us happy.
Mhm.
We do things wrong, they punish us. They
Mhm.
punish us with pain and fear and all kinds of other really bad emotions.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely. And it's fascinating, dude.
what they're trying to do is survive.
Mhm.
They want to
Right.
make sure that the physical system survives.
Mhm. Absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. And so, I mean, we spoke a little bit about some of the things you can do. I know from a practical application perspective, from making things a lot more efficient, but obviously, it's very, very different from like a standard generative AI that you see, like a language model. Can you give me can your system, perform like transitive inference and apply some of the things to unknown problems yet?
Well,
Or
you
that's
can.
not what you're going to? Is
It's
that what
really
I'm
about it's really what data you want to hook into, what types of data, various types,
Mhm,
and what the computer system is composed of. It's interesting. The algorithm has no limit,
mhm,
and it creates a system that's greater than the sum of its parts,
mhm,
but it's still composed of those parts. So you're not going to solve cancer without knowing a lot about this data or that data. So, yes, you could technically tap into some of the knowledge being produced by an LLM
mhm,
and actually sit above the LLM and rationalize on it.
mhm.
So it's not that some of the things they do are all wrong. It's
Right.
just not, it's knowledge. It's not intelligence. It's just
Yeah.
step in the process,
Mhm.
you
Absolutely.
know? Yeah. I like to think of an LLM as, a giant research staff
Mhm,
that goes and looks up all the different things you need it to look up. But
mhm,
at the end of the day, you need a lead scientist that runs that research staff who has a more global perspective of it to know how to use that knowledge and what that knowledge means.
absolutely. It's a great tool.
So this type of tool will
Mhm,
harness the LLM. So you're
mhm,
not just trying to scale it to bigger processors and more data. It can
mhm,
help you generalize that data.
mhm,
And this is what you've heard, artificial general intelligence. Where is that? Where is that? Where's that? That's because artificial general intelligence uses transitive inference
mhm,
because it can take a few pieces, even though it has no experience with what it's dealing with,
mhm,
that is a generalization function.
mhm.
So you
Ab
know that A is greater than C because you've had previous experience with both in other contexts.
Mhm. Absolutely.
And it allows you to piece those puzzles together. Because at the end of the day, what's the brain doing?
Mhm.
It's creating order out of chaos.
Right.
That's what it's designed to do. Our
Mhm.
sensory systems are a pile of chaos.
Absolutely.
How do you process it? How do you
Mm,
understand it?
mhm,
And as you get more and more experience, you'll notice you get better at understanding things. You get better at automating things.
mhm.
You don't have to read you change bikes, but you don't have to read a manual to learn how to ride a new type of bike.
Right.
You
Same thing
know,
with cars.
same with a car.
Might be a little bit of a different size, but, give yourself an hour behind the wheel and you're fine.
Yeah. All of a sudden, you've made the adjustments
Mhm,
because you used a generalized context to understand it all.
mhm.
And you've given yourself the new experiences and where to index them in your neural net
Right.
and use them. But
Absolutely.
because a lot of people don't understand, I raised my right arm, right? Hey, he raised his right arm. It's one command. No, 10,000 individual granular little reactions just went on in raising
Mhm,
my arm.
mhm,
That's how the brain sees things in these little granular transactions.
mhm.
And it makes it very, very efficient. I didn't think about raising my arm. I just said, raise my arm.
Right. Right.
Yet it initiates this massive sequence and cascade of events. And
Mhm.
they're all validated. So
Yeah.
I don't have to sit there and confirm that I raised my arm. I know it was raised.
Mhm. Mhm. Right.
So the brain isn't just executing everything for you, it's also validating everything for you.
Mhm. Right.
Why?
Absolutely.
Because it doesn't want to use conscious thought. Conscious thought's expensive, it's slow.
Mhm. Right.
Give you an idea. The thalamus is running, it's measuring at 5 milliseconds.
Mhm.
Your eyes are measuring at about 33 milliseconds. Your frontal lobe, where consciousness is running, that's 300 milliseconds.
Okay.
You
So it's
know,
there's a magnitude slower.
it's magnitude slower.
Mhm. Mhm.
So uh, you would never be able to hit a baseball if
Right.
you had to wait for consciousness.
Mhm.
Just couldn't do it.
Right.
Everything is going to be automated before you can think about it,
Mhm.
which is interesting because the way the brain's algorithm work, it actually allows it to run faster than real time.
Mhm.
It uses these granular predictions, right? Because face it, you're going to make a prediction at 300 milliseconds. Well, that 300 milliseconds is based upon 9 visual
Mhm.
inputs, 9 different slots of visual input.
Mhm.
So if I use that, what you've now predicted for me,
Mhm.
that allows me to go 9 cycles ahead.
Mm.
And I can actually skip ahead in time,
Right.
which allows your brain to operate in faster than real time mode. That's why you
Mhm.
can anticipate something. You can prepare yourself for something. Again, why? Promote survival.
Mhm. Absolutely.
All of these things help you survive at the end of the day.
Mhm. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. So, what are your, looking forward, kind of what are your next steps regarding neurosymbolic AI, with research
Well,
and application, and also what are your long-term goals for it?
let's go with the first question first. Right now, we're building a koi.
Mhm.
We're going to do it using a standard GUI, but it should be understood that we could use any AR system,
Mhm.
any type of input, output. It really doesn't matter.
Mhm.
We like the visual because, unlike a lot of other people that want to drill holes in your head to plug a
Mhm.
computer in,
Mhm.
we're like, hey, well, let's not quite do that yet.
Right. We're a couple iterations of technology.
Yeah, I don't. I've got enough problems with my smart TV. I don't need those same problems in my brain.
Yup.
Yeah, I guess the brain doesn't run Java very well. Uh,
Right.
but so uh, we like the eyes because the eyes will already do the translation for us. We don't need to encode a neural format. All we have to do is stimulate the eyes the right way. It'll do the conversion for us. It'll translate the symbols for us.
Mhm.
You know, we translate these symbols, and now all of a sudden you can interpret stuff, you can drive stuff, you can automate stuff,
Mhm.
you can actually make things go. Now
Mhm.
we're building that right now. We're working on our symbol converter and some areas of the parietal lobe for automating.
Mhm.
Now we want to get those pieces because the koi has more purpose than just allowing it to be a user interface.
Mhm.
It actually is a study interface to allow us to study consciousness,
Mhm.
how consciousness interacts with the brain,
Right.
how moral subset a lot of people wouldn't understand, but the koi actually is emotional.
Mhm.
It has
Mhm.
an emotional interface that ties it to the system, and it will
Mhm.
use emotions to try to and affect the user to look at something or consider something or raise their an escalation. We're
Mhm.
going to literally try to use the eyes to create that physical reaction.
Interesting.
You can use colors, you can use like symbols, you can use flat,
Mhm.
you can use all kinds of audio visual stuff.
Mhm.
But the whole point is to use emotions that try to regulate the system and help make the decision making, help you focus on what's important and
Mhm.
where decision making in a given activity needs to be performed.
Right.
Because that's it. You're trying to sift out that chaos.
Mhm.
Now, with that, this will allow us to study before we actually build the first artificial consciousness.
Mhm.
Believe me, I have several players that want to put the artificial consciousness into a stuffed bear,
Mhm. Mhm.
basically, so it could be like a child's best friend.
Oh, that's
You know?
terrifying.
Yeah, you think about Chucky and some of the other stuff. Yeah,
Right.
that's why I said, hey, I'll do it, but no automation on that thing.
Mhm. Right. Absolutely.
Don't let its arms and legs move.
Right. None of that. But I mean, I think from like you think about it from a child development perspective. What are you start thinking about what could the potential long-term consequences of your best friend being a stuffed bear that is a programmed, is programmed.
Well, you're basically trying to teach values. You can't think of it being
Yeah, but
the end all be all, but you could in developmental learning children, it could be quite a tool.
right. Oh, I agree. But then, I like the unintended side effects of things like
Yeah,
that. What
like
work?
social media right now.
That's exactly where I was going. Like, you just have to look at social media and and the smartphone and all of the correlating rise in, in mental health disorders and suicides among children over the last 15 years to understand what could go wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Oh yeah. Well,
you know,
it's interesting you say that, because we see that we actually see how that process happened inside of the brain. Since we know the process and the flow of it,
hmm
it becomes naturally apparent what is happening there and how they're dissociating. And certain sociology developments are not actually occurring correctly.
hmm
You know, certain safeguards, the way morality is built up, honor, these types of ephemeral measurements.
hmm
That's why people think they can say anything they want now because they got onto social media and there's no restriction on what they
right.
say.
And
And many times, no consequences.
I was gonna say, nobody's gonna hit you in the face if you call them an asshole on Twitter.
Yeah.
But you do that in person,
It's a
you know.
whole, well, this is it. Well, what's interesting is that takes you back to a more basic growing up experience.
hmm
Don't touch the stove because you're going to burn your hand.
Right. hmm
That's great and it sounds great, but until you touch that stove and burn your hand, you
Yeah.
didn't learn the lesson, did you?
hmm Right.
Once
Absolutely.
you learn the lesson, you don't need it again, do you?
Generally not.
So
Generally not.
a lot of these things sculpt our behavior, and
Mhm,
many of these pieces, especially from a social standpoint, are missing now.
mhm,
And and you ask me, where do I think this is going to go?
mhm,
I think there's a bigger society issue at hand.
mhm,
Uh, this is a key to understanding what we've come from, what we are, and what we could potentially become.
mhm,
You see in the brain that it is almost like a muscle that has to be exercised.
mhm,
It's kind of scary that H.G. Wells wasn't too far from wrong when he talked about us being Eloys, where we so disengaged ourselves, don't try anything, don't struggle to.
mhm,
Well, the brain will shrink.
mhm,
There's actually studies on Arctic researchers who are in the same environment day after day after day. After they've been down there 6 months, their hippocampus is shrunk by 20%.
hmm,
I
yeah,
mean, it's not brain damage type stuff, but it literally is if you don't use it, you lose it.
right. I can
Because at the
that
end of the
that
day,
oh,
it's an
sorry, go ahead.
energy conservation device.
Right.
It's
Mhm,
going to conserve energy. So if you're not going to use it, it's going to shuttle that energy somewhere else.
right. You mentioned that with the Antarctic researchers, and the first place that my mind went to was, what implications does that have on, say, long distance space travel, right?
Yes. If we do not stimulate the mind correctly and force challenges on the mind to keep it running, and you just do the same thing day after day after day, I understand seeing the same thing, the same visual data again and again and again. Your brain has seen it.
Mhm. Yeah.
So it will move it out. It's predictable. So it won't use any energy.
Mhm,
So,
mhm,
as good as the brain's algorithm is conserving energy, it actually can work against us.
right. Mhm,
And here's what's even scarier: you do this long term, right? And let's say you've used AI to do all your content creation. You don't have to think of anything.
mhm,
You sit back and just kind of lay around partying all day. And you just keep doing that generation after generation. We do end up like Eloy.
right.
There's a thing called epigenetics,
Mhm,
and it takes what you do and it actually encodes it into your DNA.
mhm, mhm,
So, H.G. Wells thought it would take thousands of years. Hell, it could only take 100.
And the rate of change is a lot slower in his time, it
Yeah,
can't hold
it
that
really was. So I got to blame.
again.
Even him getting onto the concept was incredible,
Right.
but
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
just incredibly how fast tracked evolution has become.
Mhm.
We think of it as some slow process, but it's a process that's constantly moving,
Mhm.
constantly evolving. There is no static state.
Mhm.
There's always the next stage. Did I survive? Do I need to learn? Does my body actually have to change physically to
Mhm.
accommodate some new activity or something that I'm doing?
Mhm. Absolutely.
So
Absolutely fascinating, man. No, it's absolutely fascinating, and you think about, um, the old adage, and I don't know how true it is about history, about how hard times create tough people, and then tough people create good times, and then good times create weak people.
yeah, it is. It
But
is the cycle. It is the
Mhm.
cycle of life, and you are
Yeah,
correct. It is
you
actually
know,
quite a truism.
and you think about things like, he's struggling and having to survive and having to, walk through difficult stuff. Those are the most defining times of people's lives generally.
They
Uh,
are. Well,
yeah.
that's what teaches them the most. It's
Mhm.
what you learn the most. It's what, makes the brain, it's exercising the brain.
Mhm.
If everything is predictable in your life, not a lot of exercise goes on.
Mhm.
It's that struggle that makes your brain bigger.
Mhm. Right.
So the more you struggle, the bigger your brain will get, the
Mhm.
more capable your brain gets. Why? Because evolution has armed you with this instrument that is literally greater than the sum of its parts.
Mhm.
It's given
Yeah.
you the ability to rise to it, to solve a problem and
Mhm.
survive in ways we never could have imagined thousands of years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite, thoughts is that people that lived 100 years ago, 100 and I'll call it 150 years ago now, their lives had more in common on a day-to-day basis than people that lived 1,000 years before them than us
Yeah.
because of rate of change, right?
Well,
Um,
yeah, the technology really has kind of put us
mhm.
on the catapult and it propelled us into space.
Well, hopefully you don't mess it up.
Well, that's it. And this is why, with this type of technology, neurosymbolic AI is a new direction, a new way. We have
Mhm.
to look at it carefully.
Absolutely.
And in some cases, we're going to have to restrict how it's used because it
Mhm.
can do a lot of damage.
Mhm.
Good things can do a lot of positive things. It can also do a lot of damage. Now, I'm not thinking about some Terminator future.
Mhm.
Personally, there's plenty of people out there that are ready to destroy the planet long before the computer ever gets to it.
Mhm.
And
I
it's
agree.
certainly not going to be an LLM because nobody's going to trust an LLM to make a decision on a critical system.
Let's hope not.
Well, no, I can tell you right now, a lot of the business leaders, they're not going to turn their
Mhm.
profit margins over to these things.
Right.
I
No, of
mean,
course not.
there's obviously high risk in it.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
and they're not worried about the plant, Terminator
Mhm.
destroying the future.
Right.
They're
Right.
worried about losing money and having to explain it to their board of
Mhm.
directors.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, and I think generative AI is an excellent tool to augment
Yes,
trained people, right? And
yes,
the great examples like I give is around it is that it because I use it on every day. I use it every day as part of doing my job. And what it allows me to focus on the things that are actually important, that I actually need to focus on and removes some, menial low level work, whether it's initial drafts of an email or anything like that, or drafts of blogs, whatever, from removes that, me having to expend that brain power. However, I certainly would never like I'm sure you heard about the attorneys that have, turned in briefs that are 100% written by generative AI systems and they just like they hallucinate, case law.
yeah,
But it's not good for that, right? It's
yeah.
good for some
Well,
stuff though.
what's interesting, it really should be good with that because that's just straight data. But
Mhm.
yeah, but you just it's interesting. I've actually had arguments with some of the authors of infinity theory. You
Mhm.
may have heard about it. Hey, once the computer has all this knowledge, it's going to be so much smarter than us.
Mhm.
Well, they ignore one fact. Infinite knowledge means infinite time.
Mhm.
And we do not have infinite time to make a decision.
Mhm. Right.
Our brains are about sorting through all the irrelevancies to make a decision.
Mhm.
And you can overload that quite simply by putting too much information in it. And that's where they're at now.
Mhm.
And that's why they can't even begin to explain an hallucination.
Right.
They don't know what really caused it. It could have been 30 different tiers of data at different angles
Mhm.
that kind of got them into kind of a decision rut,
Absolutely.
you know?
Mhm.
And the problem is, a lot of times they're just not going to answer you.
Mhm.
When they don't understand something, they don't give you an answer.
Mhm.
Well, what's interesting is the brain's process. It has to have an answer.
Mhm.
It will give you a chance to give it an answer.
Mhm.
But if you don't, it will give its own.
Yeah.
These are our animal instincts,
Mhm.
and they actually use the emotion template to decide what to do.
Mhm.
So if you're a deer and you're out in the woods and you have unpredictable motion happening,
Freeze.
your your initial instinct is flight,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
Take off. But if
Mhm.
you're a mother deer and you have a small, a fawn next to you,
Mhm.
your maternal instinct is going to make you step towards the object, fight.
Mhm.
Here's your fight and flight. You
Right.
know, again, everything decisions are going to be made because
Right.
the brain wants to survive. If you don't
Mhm.
give it the information to survive, it will give itself the information
Yep.
based on your previous experience and your emotional state.
Absolutely fascinating, man. Before we is there any, before we close up here, Dave, anything else you'd like to mention or discuss around neurosymbolic AI?
Well, it's certainly a new direction.
Mhm.
We're gonna probably get a lot. It's kind of disruptive because the one thing it does do is it's gonna reverse this trend that is killing me, which is the amount of energy these people are using up to make stupid decisions.
Mhm.
I mean, they are literally trashing our planet, and it's
Mhm.
going to get worse. That's why I cannot stand to see the environmentalists. They sit out there and say, "Oh, save the environment," as they take their pictures with their titanium phones that are
Mhm.
plugged into this stuff so they can create some content for it.
Mhm.
I mean, we got to take a real good, careful look at what we're paying for this tool.
Mhm.
Any tool you can produce it, as it turns out, in existence, you can produce intelligence in many different ways.
Mhm.
It's just one of them and happens to be a very expensive one.
Mhm.
I don't need to hear how much. In fact, they're all hiding how much energy they're using. The good news is, at least in the last 3 or 4 months,
Mhm.
I've started to see finally articles that are trying to discuss what they're doing,
Mhm.
what they're using.
Mhm.
I'm sitting here in the state of Maryland, and I found out that Maryland is shelling out like $500 million in subsidies to Virginia electrical grid
Mhm.
to power their data centers. And
That
that
makes
was probably derived off of some interstate
Mhm.
electricity sharing deal they signed 10, 20 years ago.
Mhm.
Again, who's paying? And so the data centers, they go and negotiate a really good rate with the insurance company because they are not an insurance company, but the electrical company because they want to sell electricity. That's what they do.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, everybody's rates go up to subsidize the payments of that.
Mhm.
And if you start to look, you start to see a lot of these coal burning plants that we were supposed to be shutting down.
Spin 'em back up.
They're starting them back up, and all of a sudden, this one, I think it was in West Virginia, it was supposed to be shut down this year or next year. Oh, we won't shut that down till at least 2028. And you'll
Mhm.
find in 2028, they'll still be there.
Yep.
2030, it will still be there. In fact, we will be needing more.
Mhm.
So this isn't just a war of artificial intelligence. This is a war on the resources of our planet and how we're spending it.
Mhm.
We do not need to trash our planet just so somebody doesn't have to go out and be trained to figure out how to produce some content
Yep.
or wants
Abs
to program because they don't want to learn how to program.
Mhm.
I mean,
Absolutely.
it has two detrimental effects. One, it trashes our planet, and two, it can
Mhm.
make the users dumber
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
actually affect their brains,
Mhm.
where all of a sudden they have smaller brains.
Mhm.
It's kind of crazy. It's a vicious kind of cycle.
Mhm.
The more we do, the less it has to do.
Yep. Absolutely.
So,
Yeah, man. No, I
so
appreciate you.
there's a lot of real society implications of this
I,
technology.
I agree with you. I think that on I agree with you when it comes to trash in the planet. I think that the main area that was a main mistake that was made was the area of marketing. Think it around like the planet's gonna be fine in the long run, maybe in a couple million years. We're gonna be dead though, because we're gonna make it uninhabitable for ourselves as a
Yeah.
result. And so I'm 100% with you. I think that there's absolutely more efficient ways that we can be doing this and more efficient ways we can be sending resources. So,
Well, this is
I
it.
hope I hope
It's how
you're
much is in your gas tank. That's our resources on this planet.
mhm,
How, yeah, I often like to say, you don't need to burn down the forest to heat up a cup of tea.
mhm. Yeah,
If it takes a few twigs, guess what? That's the best way to do it.
mhm.
Light the twigs on fire, heat your tea, but don't
Yep,
burn the forest down in the process.
correct.
And these
Absolutely.
people don't seem to care. It was like Bill Gates. He comes out and says, well, AI is going to solve its own energy problems. What the hell is he talking about?
I don't even know what that means.
He's actually talking about, well, what's interesting
Mhm,
is he's actually referring to something that the electrical companies were doing called smart meter.
mhm.
Remember the smart meter revolution?
Yeah,
Guess what? It never happened.
mm,
Doesn't mean they didn't install them.
just
Doesn't
not
mean they don't use it to read data and bill you, but it was supposed to give them a level of intelligence that allowed them to detail detail how the electricity was used, and through
mhm,
that gain efficiency.
mhm.
That's what Bill Gates is talking about. But guess what? It didn't happen because they didn't solve the volume problem.
Well, I feel like that brings us full circle back to exactly what you do,
Yeah.
and exactly the problems your algorithm and Neuro-Symbolic are here to and Neuro-Symbolic AI are here to tackle, man. Dave, I really appreciate you coming on to
Oh,
Robots and
not a
Dave and
I
chatting with me today.
certainly, I'm looking for places to talk about this.
Yeah,
It's time we had real discussions on this stuff and get through this AI hype because
mhm,
it's looking like it's human. If we use 10,000 more GPUs, it'll be human. No,
nope,
that's like sitting there saying, hey, 100 years ago, if we add more index cards into our, Dewey Decimal System in our library, it'll somehow turn into a computer.
mhm, right.
I,
They're not the same.
it's not the same.
Absolutely, man.
How you design something, that it has a consequence that it leads to. What
Mhm,
they have does not lead to that. And understand, it's about money. You sell this stuff, you sell it.
mhm,
Understand,
yeah,
business and technology have not, they are very unfriendly bedfellows at times.
at times, man. Dave, thank you so much for coming on today. Hope you have a wonderful one.
Well, thanks so much, Nick. I appreciate it, man.
Thank you.